Stoneflies have yet a different life cycle and behavior. Like the other two, they have a larval stage underwater, but they don't hatch on the water's surface like mayflies and caddisflies. These insects crawl to streamside rocks and vegetation and hatch into adults out of the water on the bank, so the adults are not available as often to the trout. However, stonefly adults are clumsy flyers and they often get blown into the water by the wind, or they fall on the surface and are also available to trout when they return to the water to lay eggs. Midges are so small that they might seem insignificant, but they can be an important source of trout food. In fact, in tailwater rivers below dams, they can be the primary source of trout food, and if you fish these rivers, you better pay attention to midges. Midges start life as a worm-like larva that trout eat in great quantities. Like caddisflies, they have a pupa stage, which is readily spotted by the trout near the surface and easy to capture. And like caddisflies, midges fly away quickly once they sprout their wings. But trout do eat the adults as well, especially when it's really cold or windy and the flies have trouble taking off. Midges also return to the water to mate, lay eggs, and die, and they often form large clusters of from 2 to dozens of insects hooked together. Trout eat these midge clusters, and it allows you to fish a bigger fly when imitating these tiny insects. How did trout respond to these hatches? Well, sometimes they don't respond, which is very frustrating. Maybe the water's too cold and the fish are reluctant to come to surface. Sometimes the hatch is not heavy enough to interest trout. Maybe the trout are just acting like jerks. But when they do respond, trout first begin to eat the nymphs close to the bottom as the insects get active before their migration to the surface. This is a good time to fish a nymph. Then, as the insects begin to drift in the current, as they rise to the surface, trout begin to intercept them more in midwater and will feed closer to the surface. Finally, the fish will feed at all levels or may even concentrate mostly on insects trapped at the surface. This is the height of the hatch, when fish feed most actively and gives you some of the best fishing because they lose most of their caution in their eagerness to feed. When insects first reach the surface, they have two problems. First, the meniscus represents a physical barrier to the insects, and also at this point, they need to emerge from their larval skin and hatch into a winged adult. This can happen quickly, or it can take minutes. Trout know these struggling insects are easy pickings, and they seem to prefer them in this stage, which we call an emerger. Once the winged adults have emerged, sometimes they ride the water for a long time, especially if it's cold or rainy. On dry, sunny days, the insects may fly away almost immediately. The longer an insect rides the water, the more likely it is that a trout will feed on the adult. Then, once insects return to the water to mate and lay eggs, typically in large groups, trout wait for the dead and dying flies lying spent in the water to wash down where they can be eaten. If just one insect is hatching, the puzzle's not that hard to figure out. However, if more than one insect is hatching at the same time, you should try to figure out which one the trout prefer. You can try to observe which one they are eating by watching fish rise, trying to determine which insect disappears in the rise. But that's often difficult, and it's not always easy to tell which stage the trout are taking. Are they eating the emerger just under the surface, or are they eating the fully emerged adult, or are they eating both? Sometimes trout eat all of them at all stages, but sometimes they get picky and prefer one type or one stage. If you observe the rise forms of the trout, though, you may pick up some clues. If a rise is very splashy, the fish is probably either taking emergers or eating a large fluttering insect. If there are no bubbles in the rise form, the trout is taking an emerger just under the surface. If there are bubbles in the rise form, the trout is taking flies off the surface because as they feed on the surface, they ingest air, which is then expelled through their gills. If the rise is subtle and just produces a ring, trout are usually taking small insects on the surface, mayfly spinners, or spent egg-laying caddis.